Thank you so much, everyone. I am going to be talking today about digital therapeutics. That is a term which many of you may not be familiar with. I had not heard of it until fairly recently. So I remember when I was trying to think about what I wanted to do for my CDS presentation. I'm a huge healthcare nerd, so obviously something in healthcare, but there's a lot of interesting things happening in the realm of digital health right now. And there was a point last summer when I read that the FDA had approved a video game to treat ADHD, which I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, I've used different apps to help track symptoms, to help manage medication usage, things like that, but I'd never heard of the app itself actually being the medication. So that was what inspired me to look a little bit more into it. Digital therapeutics are a really interesting sort of new up and coming trend in digital health. My goal today is to kind of walk you guys through what they are, why they're important, and particularly why now they're so timely. Talk a little bit about some benefits and challenges, and ultimately just get you excited about this new development. Frankly, digital therapeutics can kind of fundamentally alter how we interact with medicine and what we think of as medicine. So Joe, if you'll go to the next slide, please, then we'll dive into some background info. Cool. So digital therapeutics essentially leverage technology and data to help improve health outcomes. Digital therapeutics, or DTX, as I'll call them for short, are basically evidence-based, completely software-driven interventions that are designed to treat a specific disease by improving a specific outcome. So what this might mean, potentially with that example with the ADHD treatment, is that you would have an app that incorporates scientific principles around cognitive behavioral therapy and behavior change to actually modify your sort of scores on clinical measures as you use this app. And then they would take this app, they would test it and run it through actual clinical trials, and in many cases get FDA approval. So there are several on the market right now. There's the one for ADHD, there's some for insomnia, things for substance use and opioid use, and there's actually some that are in trials right now for things like schizophrenia and other more sort of intense, if you will, psychiatric conditions. So it is really, really exciting, but they're certainly new. And the specific subset that are prescription approved are it's kind of like a Wild West field in digital health right now. But the really exciting thing about them is that they enable use of big data in a way that we haven't really seen before. Because a lot of times you have digital health apps that are just collecting information about you, but they're not really tied to a specific health outcome. Payers don't really understand how they're tracking against metrics and things like that. But I'll draw your attention to the graphic here at the bottom of the slide, just to give you sort of some context about where DTX sit under the broader umbrella of digital health. So I put them far on the left, if we call the left side kind of very specific, very targeted, need to be approved by the FDA. And as you move farther right, things get a bit more loosey-goosey, if you will. So there's digital therapeutics on the far left, and then you kind of move to things like companion apps. Think maybe you have a smart inhaler and it has an app on your phone that sort of informs why you're using it, when you're using it, things like that. You go farther over to things like disease management apps, and these might be platforms that help you, manage chronic conditions. They're not necessarily associated with a particular symptom or particular disease, and they're not necessarily prescribed by a doctor. Things on the far right might be meditation apps, self-guided nutrition, self-guided fitness, things like that. So digital therapeutics are certainly on a far end of the spectrum. And they're also very timely. Joe, if you'll go to the next slide, I'll show you guys some quotes that I heard in my interviews with different stakeholders. So these kind of showcase how much things have changed since the onset of COVID, essentially. COVID has really forced us to move into a world of digital health. I heard from Bronwyn Spira, who runs a physical therapy digital platform, that they saw nearly 150% increase in utilization. I heard from Ian Chang, who works at a digital health investment firm, that nearly 90% of doctors' visits were virtual during the pandemic. And that was similarly kind of confirmed in my chat with the CFO of Optum Health, who said that nearly 3/4 of care is now delivered virtually, and previously it was 3/4 were in person. So really what we're seeing is that digital health is more normalized and people are more comfortable with it. And that kind of laid a foundation. People needed to be comfortable with telemedicine before they were comfortable with something like a digital therapeutic. So if we go to the next slide, I'll discuss this a little bit more, but yeah, I think it's really interesting. In all of my interviews, people kept echoing this theme of sort of, we now have a foundation from telemedicine that we can build upon and create this larger and sort of more comprehensive digital health ecosystem. And it's really interesting because telemedicine is frankly pretty commoditized. When you think about it, video chatting with your doctor, it's just a capability. Anyone can replicate that. And we're seeing that in the digital health world. Nearly every company that does digital health in some form is offering telemedicine visits now. And digital therapeutics are kind of quite the opposite. They're very specific, they're for a specific disease, they're rigorously tested, and they're often approved by the FDA. So that is a really interesting change because it's less of a capability and more of a business model. If you think about the fact that it's not replicable, has a long development process, and it can be monetized because you can kind of prove or demonstrate return on investment since it's benchmarked to like gold standard clinical metrics. So that's kind of a really exciting difference from what most people think of as telemedicine. If we jump into the next slide, I will go through some of the benefits for different stakeholders because there are quite a few and they're pretty exciting. If you think about it from a patient perspective, patients have always wanted to have more on-demand and accessible personalized healthcare, especially amidst COVID. Healthcare, most people would agree that healthcare has been a pretty archaic industry and it's lagged behind a lot of other industries in terms of customer satisfaction. You can check any source and see pretty abysmal NPS scores. I think everyone knows that waiting times for in-person care are crazy long, whether you're in line at a pharmacy, waiting to see a doctor, or waiting to even just book an appointment to see a specialist. So the notion of care at your fingertips is really attractive for patients. I think also customers and consumers are accustomed to having historical data and usage metrics available for things like utilities, shopping, cell phone plans, really anything else. So why don't we have that for healthcare? So the idea of these apps that really record and track your metrics over time and make that easily accessible and transparent to consumers is incredibly attractive. If you're thinking about providers, things like digital therapeutics are also great for them. Providers who have access to more data can use things like AI and machine learning to make more informed treatment decisions. If you can see how someone is responding, you can alter their treatment in real time. You can sort of see how treatments integrate with their overall health plan, and you kind of get this evolving real-time picture of a patient's health. That's both on an individual level and a population level, and that matters a lot for payers. Payers are insurance companies and sometimes employers, really anyone who's footing the bill for these technologies. And really they care about cost savings. And in the world of healthcare, cost savings is how you measure value. An insurance company has to know that because they're paying for me to use this app, my health is going to improve, and that's going to help me avoid going to the hospital or seeing a doctor later on. So that's how they measure value. And it's really interesting because payers and large employers have the sort of analytical prowess to really take advantage of the data that things like digital therapeutics provide. And they want to be able to do that on both the individual and population level. Though, there are a lot of pros. Obviously, there's plenty of cons that go along with them when it comes to digital therapeutics. So if we jump into the next slide, I will go over some of the barriers to adoption and kind of why these things haven't taken off quite as quickly as you might hope. The first one deals with regulatory approval. The FDA is pretty finicky, as goes for every governing body in healthcare across different countries. When it comes to approving drugs, the approval process for traditional medications is very well defined, and it's something that is very different than this new regulatory pathway for digital medicine. There is a lot of talk about how to best determine best practices for evaluating a completely software-driven therapy. And also there's a lot of evolving sort of frameworks regarding how do you even design a clinical trial to test a software-driven intervention. There's some pretty specific challenges that you don't see in other things. Like, for example, if you're testing, giving someone a drug versus a control group, you give them a placebo drug. Well, how do you design a placebo app? How do you test How do you sort of remove the confounding variables of people's comfort level with technology, their familiarity with using apps in the first place, maybe generational divides? So there's a lot of questions that come into place in terms of how you actually measure the incremental app or the incremental value that the app itself is adding. I think that the companies are going to be need to be really creative in designing clinical trials and communicating value to the FDA. The next bullet point is about reimbursement. Of course, cost savings is the name of the game. And it's been interesting because for digital health, historically, it's been pretty difficult for them to prove cost savings. I think this is actually an area where digital therapeutics have a big advantage. Because they are benchmarked against certain metrics, they can actually track how people are improving over time and essentially prove that their app is making a difference. That said, though, it's interesting because a lot of drugs are priced by benchmarking the drug to other similar therapies. For these DTX, they're either the first of their kind or there's very little to compare them to. So companies can't really price the drugs in that way. And it's also difficult because drug pricing is rooted very heavily in the R&D and development costs, which are, like the clinical trials, very well understood for traditional therapies, not understood at all by the FDA for software development. So I think that these companies are really going to have to be clear about their R&D costs, the software costs, and things that go into kind of bringing these drugs to market in order to warrant certain price points. The third point is selecting the right disease areas. As you might have picked up on, a lot of the areas that are kind of ripe for digital disruption are cognitive and mental health, things that you can alter with behavior change and things like that. There's a lot of disease areas that simply need in-person care. And we're not quite at a place yet where any single disease area is kind of ripe for this digital disruption. So not only does it have to be an area of high impact and one of unmet need, but it has to be a disease area that you can realistically alter with a purely digital intervention. And then the last kind of main barrier that I picked up on when I was talking to different stakeholders was the question of how to pursue or sort of what route to market a player should pursue. Digital health has, in the kind of historically, most companies have pursued a direct-to-consumer approach. A lot of this is because companies weren't approved by the FDA, or it's kind of something where it was difficult to convince these larger players that it is something they should reimburse and support and help get to the general public. That's kind of changing though. And I think that especially for DTX, it's something that large players like huge employers and big insurers would find very attractive. These are players that really want to lower their costs, that want to leverage analytics and data to make better decisions. And that's perfect for DTX. Frankly, it's something where I think if they can figure out how to develop those B2B partnerships, that will actually be a much more fruitful way for them to gain traction with much wider audiences and much, much quicker as well. It's also interesting to consider whether some of these players might want to pursue a go-to-market strategy that involves acquisition by a large company like Optum, United, CVS, Aetna, things like that. A lot of these large players are so beholden to shareholders and returns that they really need clear ROI. And that's something that digital health has had a lot of trouble with in the past. But I think that as digital therapeutics can prove that they're tied directly to health outcomes, that they are improving health metrics over time, and that they're helping really move the needle in terms of population health, that'll help prove that digital therapeutics are not just a commodity like telemedicine and much more of an actual scalable business model. So in sum, I hope that I've helped you all see a little bit about digital therapeutics and how they are a really attractive opportunity for both patients, providers, investors, and payers. When you think about it, the type of data that you can get from a digital therapeutic is really valuable for many different groups. You can show value creation, you can examine public health, you can use it for AI-assisted diagnostic decisions. And essentially, as a patient, you're much more empowered with a real-time understanding of your own health metrics. Thank you. The next slide is a little Q&A, but we can.
Alex, great job.
Thank
For
you.
folks, please use the raise your hand function. I have one quick question for you. Given that so much of digital therapeutics is about behavior change and understanding how to nudge the patient in this case, or in the right direction, do you see big tech as being a primary kind of investor going forward, given that they kind of already have that skill set? And like, what's their role, and what's kind of preventing them, companies like Facebook and Google, from getting into the space more heavily?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up. I know that a lot of companies that I've talked to, and kind of in my own experience in my internship last summer at CVS and some of the interviews I did with other sort of big players, increasingly they are seeing companies like Google and Amazon as direct competitors. And those were conversations that people were having like almost daily, which is, I think, really causing them to try to rethink their strategy. I think that it's something where there is some degree of sort of trust in terms of like industry. Like I think there are certain parties you have to get on board, like the FDA or other sort of physicians associations and groups that maybe don't have that level of inherent trust with certain big tech organizations. But I do believe that's going to increasingly shift. And I think that especially like these digital therapeutics that aren't necessarily FDA approved and they're just like more clinical, but not something you need a prescription for. I think that's something where big tech is really going to be able to potentially bring more of those to market.
Dynamite. Elise, go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. I was wondering, what is an example of a success story for a digital therapeutics tool? Like, what is the one that had the most success?
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, honestly, that ADHD one was one of the ones I found most interesting. There's a lot of them that are a little bit fuzzier in terms of, I was talking to some companies that do things with opioid abuse and like behavior change. And so a lot of it is about kind of accountability, symptom tracking, support groups. It brings in elements that are less sort of therapeutic in nature. But I think a lot of the success stories are ones that are rooted in behavioral therapy and behavior change. It's actually really interesting. And I know this doesn't directly answer your question, but there was a pretty big news story break a couple months ago where a clinical trial like failed to produce results for one that's trying to come to market for schizophrenia. And so that raised a whole bunch of questions about like, can we actually do this for disease areas that are not purely mental health or behavioral health? And I know that in some of the conversations I had with stakeholders, it's interesting. There's a company called Amalgam RX where they're actually a platform company. They're a platform to help develop digital therapeutics. And I feel like even for me as someone who's just getting into this field, I was still trying to grapple with like what exactly that meant. Like I've heard of platforms to develop other things before, but like a platform for digital therapeutics was a very new concept to me. So I think there's been so few success stories so far that it will be interesting to like keep an eye on the industry and see which ones actually can gain a lot of traction, because even the ones that have done well so far have a very small user base so far.
Hey, Roderick, you're up.
Yeah, great job, Alex, and I really enjoyed the presentation. I had a question kind of related to what Elise was asking as far as getting an approval from the FDA. And then, how long do you think that would actually take for them? Let's say they go through a trial with one of these digital therapeutics platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Usually with mental health, it's not like you see an improvement right away, especially whenever you're using a digital platform versus a pill.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it'll take to get these clinical trials approved and then push through with the FDA so they can actually use insurance to pay for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The FDA approval process does typically take a long time. It can take several years, depending how many sort of phases of trials you have to do. And we actually saw during COVID a lot of apps, not necessarily all digital therapeutics, but a lot of just general health apps got sort of conditional approvals where you could use them in some shape or form. But it was definitely ones that like were going in a more of a direct to consumer fashion. It's interesting. I think when I was talking to a couple people, the idea came up that we might see more of these conditional approvals. And to your point, if it's something where you need a long time to see improvements in outcomes, I could see them doing sort of phased approvals where, the therapy is approved, people begin using it, but then the company is sort of held responsible for reporting real world evidence at certain intervals to prove sort of over time that the therapy is indeed having the outcomes and the improvements that it's claiming to have or that it claimed to have in the trial. I think there's also part of the reason that the approval landscape is so fuzzy right now is because people still aren't sure that like, is the actual effect that this app is having in a very controlled environment, are you going to see that replicated in the real world? So I do think we'll see like waves of sort of temporary and then full approvals. I could see that being like the norm.
All right, Emma.
Yeah, and this is going to be a very basic question, but it did come up to me while I was listening. So aside from all of the numerous regulatory and sort of clinical complexities, how do you get people to treat apps as medicine? Because it strikes me like we're used to interacting with the healthcare system through these really old, antiquated like health portals that are mostly for managing your appointments and data. And then there's the wellness space, which is very much like doing this for sort of a personal care, self-care perspective. But I don't really think of any app that I use as medicine. And I'm wondering, like, does that require a perspective shift on the part of users?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it totally does. And I think that's sort of a big reason why, yeah, if you think about the fact that like a lot of doctors before they were sort of forced to shift to digital with COVID weren't really comfortable with it, even though it was literally just having the same visit, but over a video camera. And I think that's sort of a level of foundational trust that needed to be established in order for people to even consider something like this. So the idea of like an app as actually medicine is certainly new and certainly still being proven, but I think it's something people are increasingly open to. And I think that when I spoke to a couple different people, they sort of said that, you know, you have a doctor and you kind of normalize the idea of using a digital tool for care. They see, all right, this is working, it's working well, it's providing the same, if not better care for my patients. And then that sort of sparks the idea like, oh man, I wish that I could prescribe them something that they could continue to use and I could continue to see results come back in from and reports kind of come in real time. So I think once people get a taste of like the possibility of introducing technology more into healthcare in that way, then it opens up people's minds to it. But I do totally agree. I think it's sort of a viewpoint shift that's happening right now, which is why I think that like these aren't really going to gain a ton of traction in the immediate future, but in maybe 2 to 3 years, I think we'll really see them flourish a lot more.
Lauren.
Thanks for having me join. Hi, Alex. I thought that was great. So speaking from someone who's in healthcare and not in business, so a lot of money is spent, especially in this country, in the end of life stage, and whether that's when you're really old or when you have a terminal illness when you're younger and you're dying. And I also think a lot of money is spent on underserved populations, whether that's via the government or whatever like source they're getting money in. And so typically those populations, elderly people, people who are really sick, people who are underserved, don't really have good access to technology, or they're not as good at adapting to a new technological way of life. So how would you imagine like using a digital therapeutic for that type of population, which I could see being the ones that might need it most?
That's actually a really good question. And it's really tough. I know I was like, I want to pick your brain more about this because I know you're more on that.
We can go offline if you want.
I had a conversation with one of the healthcare professors here almost about that, because she does a lot of work in public health. And she was saying that, frankly, a lot of the, to your point, a lot of the customers who would benefit from these sort of hands-off apps people can use on their own time, they don't have to, you sort of remove like the geographic or economic barriers of getting to a hospital, getting to a clinic. For things like that are highly stigmatized, like substance use, it's much nicer to pursue a treatment in the comfort of your home, potentially in privacy. And a lot of people who like don't have the economic means to get a smartphone or have access to that, it's really difficult. And even on the price point, like if you could distribute these via like Medicare or something, that would be amazing. But also the price point is like too high for what a lot of Medicare is willing to pay. So yeah, she echoed those frustrations, and it's not really an answer, but it's definitely something people are talking about, at least.
Alex, one question I have for you is, as we think about digital therapeutics as a treatment option, how much is this an and versus an or kind of scenario? So if you imagine sort of the, you know, digital therapeutics for behavior modification as a treatment for, you know, whether it's heart disease, and it's, hey, it's medication, but it's also behavior modification, which is something that's typically found in treatment plans today. Just these are kind of an assist. Do you think that's more where this might head, or is this really looking to be an or solution for, here's your options, you can have medication or digital therapeutics?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of an and. I mean, it's like personal view, but at least for the immediate future, it seems like it is much more of an and. I know when I was talking to Bronwyn, who's the CEO of Force Therapeutics, it's not like technically a digital therapeutic, but they do. She was talking to me about how beneficial it can be to just reduce the number of in-person encounters to the bare minimum, whether it's, you know, a surgery, something that you have to do in person, and then try to convert as much as you can in terms of like follow-up, physical therapy, ongoing care, converting as much of that as possible to digital, which I think is more realistic, because there are frankly just a lot of things that you can't do fully digitally. But I think a lot of the follow-up care, adherence, things like that, and kind of measuring like long-term compliance, I think that's more realistic to switch to a fully digital avenue.
Well, fantastic. This was really informative, really exciting presentation and area of research. Thank you, Alex. And everyone give Alex a big round of applause.